What is going on, everybody? Welcome on into the FanDuel Facebook Live Waiver Wire Q&A for week number 10 as we are getting you set to fill out those waiver wire requests for this week in your season-long fantasy football leagues. My name is Jim Sannes. I am a senior writer and analyst for NumberFire.com, joined here as always by JJ Zachariason. He is the editor-in-chief of FanDuel and NumberFire. JJ, pretty big quarterback news already for today. We'll get to that in a second. But first of all, how are you doing as we get set for week number 10?
I'm good. Let's talk about this quarterback news.
Yeah, because some things just dropped before we went on the air here, and we'll get to your questions in just 1 second. Make sure you leave those questions on Facebook Live in the comment section. You can also tweet those, and we'll get them on the air that way. But the big news right now is that Nick Foles will be regaining the starting job for Jacksonville after their bye week, and Cam Newton is now an injured reserve. So a lot of ripple effects here, JJ. Let's start with the Jaguars. What's the fallout for them with Foles becoming the starter once again after their bye?
Yeah, look, I mean, Gardner Minshew definitely stepped in and played well, at least versus expectation and what we thought and how we thought he would perform. But I think it's a fair thing for Jacksonville to do to throw Nick Foles back under center. I think he's the safer, probably better quarterback right now. And anytime you get that, you get more scoring opportunities for the entire offense. So I think this is good news for Leonard Fournette in an offense where, you might think that Leonard Fournette's high target share is due to Gardner Minshew being under center, but it's really the offensive coordinator and DeFilippo. We saw that. We've seen that historically with him. So Leonard Fournette should still see similar market share numbers, but I would argue that the positive touchdown regression, you can feel a little bit more confident about it hitting with Nick Foles under center. And then Dede Westbrook, if he can get healthy, and hopefully he can with his bye week, but Dede Westbrook and Nick Foles showed some rapport during the preseason. He was targeted pretty heavily. I think there was one game in the preseason, if I recall correctly, where like the entire first quarter or first half even was only targets to Leonard Fournette and Dede Westbrook. So I could see Dede Westbrook being fed a little bit and just being that safety blanket for Nick Foles. So I think those are probably the two biggest winners. But I wouldn't really downgrade DJ Chark. I wouldn't feel much differently about him. We know he's a big play guy, and their schedule down the stretch is actually pretty nice as well. So that whole passing attack and that whole offense could actually be all right.
Yeah, I think it was 9 throws for Nick Foles in preseason week 2 or week 3. 6 were to Dede and 3 were to Leonard Fournette. So definitely was pretty fun to watch there. But they know they have a floor with Gardner Minshew. They've seen that floor, and they know that it's a steady floor. So if Nick Foles doesn't do well, they can always go back to Gardner Minshew. So there's no way in which this is a downgrade for the Jaguars. It's kind of only upside here because they can always go back to Gardner Minshew if things really do flame out. What about with the Panthers here? We know Kyle Allen is going the rest of the way. It seems like we should keep status quo. Anything you would alter there with the Carolina Panthers going forward?
I think it just depends on what your expectation was when Cam Newton were to hypothetically come back. If you were thinking that Newton would come back and be able to run the football as well as we've seen him do historically, maybe that would hurt Christian McCaffrey a little bit in the red zone and him stealing some of those scores. I would argue that Cam might be the better player for someone like Curtis Samuel to get the ball down the field. But Kyle Allen's been fine. We kind of have seen both DJ Moore and Curtis Samuel not necessarily have the highest floors in the world, but DJ Moore in particular, he was actually in my 15 transactions column this week. He's someone who's a great buy candidate because he's seen 23% or more of Carolina's targets in each of his last 4 games. He just hasn't found the end zone. So hopefully that positive regression hits. But we kind of have seen what this Panthers offense looks like with Kyle Allen. I think we should just basically expect the same moving forward.
And it's not just the shares for DJ Moore, the raw target totals, even when you account for maybe not the most pass-heavy offense, those have been good too. He has 8, 10, 9, and 10 targets the past 4 games. So those touchdowns should come for DJ Moore eventually. Let's get to some questions here via Facebook Live. Brad Senger wants to know, which Colts tight end would you target this week against Miami? Jack Doyle or Eric Ebron? And part of this would obviously depend on the health of Jacoby Brissett because Brian Hoyer looked fine on Sunday, but I think we would lower both Jack Doyle and Eric Ebron if it were Brian Hoyer starting versus Jacoby Brissett. But it sounds like Brissett could play. So what are your broad thoughts on these 2 Indy tight ends this week against Miami?
I mean, it's pretty similar to how I feel about both of them when they're both healthy, in that Jack Doyle will probably give you a little bit more volume, will be a little bit more involved between the 20s. And I think that he's the safer option. He had like a 13% target share this past weekend. Eric Ebron only saw 6 or 7% of the targets. So I'd probably lean Doyle. He ran a lot of routes as well this past week. But both of them, I would say, have a similar projection only because Eric Ebron just naturally has a little more touchdown upside.
Yeah, Jack Doyle hasn't had a lot of upside this year. He has 3 targets, at least 16 yards downfield, but 2 of those have come in the 2 games T.Y. Hilton has missed. So
Right.
if Hilton does miss, I think it does increase the upside here for Jack Doyle a bit. Question here from Pierre. He wants to know, would you trade Le'Veon Bell for Odell Beckham in the Standard League? 2 guys who've had a rough year so far. Le'Veon Bell sounds like the MRI on his knee came back clean, so he should be okay from a health perspective. Which guy do you want the rest of the way between Le'Veon Bell and Odell Beckham?
Man, that's rough. I would say, I can understand if you're a running back needy team and going with Bell. I mean, Odell Beckham has seen a decent target share throughout this entire season. I think I would just go with Bell there because the schedule, continues to be wide open for that Jets offense. I know that they weren't able to take advantage of it all that much this past week, but Le'Veon Bell wasn't all that bad this past week, at least from a floor perspective. I think the ceiling is capped, but for both players. It's not just Le'Veon Bell where the scoring opportunities aren't really there. So I think I would lean Bell in this situation and maybe buy Bell a little bit low right now because people are worried about that injury, and maybe the injury isn't really an injury. We saw that they added Adams or they protected him basically by bringing him up from the practice squad, but there are other injuries that are going on in that backfield where it's not just Le'Veon Bell who's banged up. So I might lean Le'Veon Bell there because I think he's just the safer option of the two.
Yeah, Le'Veon got 9 targets on Sunday, partially inflated because he got a lot of dump-offs on the final drive, but it was a good number. And Trenton Cannon went on injured reserve last week, and Ty Montgomery also got banged up in that same game. So promoting Josh Adams, to me, does not signal anything wrong with Le'Veon. Pierre also has both Phillip Rivers and Matthew Stafford. Which one of those would you trade to get A.J. Green between Phillip Rivers and Matthew Stafford?
I don't know if I would. Well, I mean, I guess I would trade a quarterback for AJ Green. It's just a quarterback. I mean, I guess I would trade. I would rather have Matthew Stafford than Phillip Rivers overall. The main reason, if you look at what this offense has been doing under Darrell Bevell, they're throwing the ball down the field a lot. Matthew Stafford right now has thrown it 15 plus air rate. But I would probably lean Matthew Stafford there to keep, only because we're seeing him produce a little bit more. And if you can get if the trade is open for either of those players, I would rather give up Phillip Rivers.
Yeah. What are your broad thoughts on AJ Green though? I know you mentioned you look like you're a little hesitant, and now he has Ryan Finley as his quarterback, and Finley again, the oldest quarterback in the AFC North. What's your outlook for AJ Green in that offense?
Yeah, I mean, the way that I kind of see it is if you can get A.J. Green as an only upside play, and what I mean by that is giving up Phillip Rivers to get A.J. Green, giving up these guys who aren't really that necessary to be rostering on your fantasy team to get someone like A.J. Green who, we have no idea what his outlook's going to look like for a lot of reasons. I think that's fine. Now, if I'm trading a usable piece for A.J. Green, that's where I draw the line and I say, obviously, the injury risk is there. Obviously, there's a backup quarterback that's going to be throwing the rock and slinging it around. I just think there's a lot of downside with A.J. Green as well, where I'm not giving up a usable piece. But really, it's all up in the air. I personally don't think that Andy Dalton was close to the biggest problem in that offense. No. I think that this move from Dalton to Finley is very much more of a, we're not making the playoffs, clearly. We're rebuilding this team. We want to see what we have in Finley. And Zach Taylor said as much, right? Where they want to see what they have in this backup quarterback because they need to assess what they're going to do in the future. So that tells me that they don't even necessarily have confidence in Finley. This isn't a move because they're trying to improve the quarterback spot. That's not good for all of the wideouts on that team. It could end up being good, but I think if you're playing probability, it's probably not the best situation.
Backup quarterback, 4th-string left tackle, a lot of changes on the interior line, no John Ross. It's not a good offense, and that does limit the upside for sure. Jason Charles Lyon wants to know, is Juju Smith-Schuster droppable? He is loaded at wide receiver. We know the upside, kind of spotty, given that Mason Rudolph does not throw deep, but Juju is still involved, at least in this offense. So are you hanging on to Juju right now?
I'm hanging on. Yeah. I mean, I think that you could make the argument in certain weeks that he's benchable for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, even this past week, you could have made that argument because you know the way the Steelers are going to run this offense, especially if they're in a close game or especially if they're going to have a positive script. What we saw against Miami was they lost their lead pretty quickly, and they were forced to throw the ball down the field a little bit more. But we saw this past week when the game script was a little bit more neutral, how they were fine and content with dumping the ball off to Jalen Samuels 45 times. So to me, Juju is still sort of in that low end wide receiver 2, high end wide receiver 3 territory where, he's similar to from a production standpoint. He's going to have these boomer bust weeks, not unlike someone like Robbie Anderson or something, right? They're just kind of grouped in that same tier, whereas Juju just has a little bit more upside because he's the better player.
All right, let's move on here to Bethany Peters asking, Kenyon Drake, buy, hold, or sell? Kenyon Drake obviously had a big week last week for Arizona, but now we add David Johnson, likely being back to pretty much full health in the fold here. Chase Edmonds could be back a couple weeks later. Tough schedule because they have Tampa Bay and San Francisco and then a bye. So what are you doing with Kenyon Drake right now based on all that information?
Yeah, in a vacuum, I think he's a sell, mostly because David Johnson could be back. And when David Johnson's back, I think they'll utilize DJ more as a receiver and keep Kenyon Drake seeing some decent amounts of early down work. But like you said, the matchups are rough. And Kenyon Drake's not going to see the same type of workload that he saw this past week. Now, with that being said, when you're playing the market and you're looking at how other people view these players, I think a lot of people understand this. They understand that David Johnson's coming back and then Kenyon Drake is all of a sudden worthless. So I don't know if you were to trade Kenyon Drake, if you were to get anything of significance back. So because of the way that he looked in that offense last week, I'm more inclined to just hold because I don't know that you can get anything significant in return.
Yep, I think that makes a lot of sense. If we know this, everyone else does too, as far as David Johnson returning. So that definitely does influence things. Matthew wants to know, need a quarterback to pick up off the waiver wire. Both might have buys. Any good suggestions? So JJ, top streamers to send out to you a quarterback for week number 10.
Yeah, it's a very, very crappy week for quarterback streaming. I think that the top quarterback streamer this week is Ryan Tannehill. I don't feel amazingly confident in saying that. But Kansas City, they've given up the 11th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks this year. We know that with Patrick Mahomes back specifically, if he does return, even if he doesn't, but we know that there's a chance that Tennessee's going to have to play catch up, which with that particular offense, it's a good thing because we know they want to run the ball and play a little bit more conservatively. So as a result, you might see the touchdown swing to be more passing as opposed to rushing. And you'll see a little bit more volume from Ryan Tannehill. So he's the main streamer this week. I think you could look at Brian Hoyer or Brissett if he's on your waiver wire. And you could maybe look at Derek Carr as well. But I am a little bit worried about what we saw from that Chargers team this past week in that that defensive line looked back and healthy and ready to rock and roll. So a little bit worried about Derek Carr from that perspective. But I think Ryan Tannehill is probably your option. And if you really want to risk it, if you really want to get crazy, you could go to Danny Dimes. You could go to Daniel Jones, but Daniel Jones is frightening to watch the way that he handles the ball and can't hold on to the ball.
And he does love them sacks. So hopefully it's not a league or a league where you lose points for sacks. Those don't exist. So hopefully that's a good thing. But he would be in play. As far as Ryan Tannehill goes, he has been efficient this year and just been the play calling that's been the question mark. So if we increase the number of attempts, that should increase his fantasy output. So I agree. He's a pretty attractive streamer for this week. Garrett Irvin asked, just got offered Nick Chubb for Aaron Jones. Do you have a lean the rest of the way? Now, Aaron Jones obviously does split some time with Jamal Williams, but now Kareem Hunt is there for Nick Chubb. So between those two guys, which would you prefer the rest of the way?
I don't know if I have a strong preference here, to be honest. I think that's a pretty fair, straight up deal. I would say, to help make this decision, how involved do you think Kareem Hunt is going to be in this offense? My fear with Kareem Hunt is that he's going to steal a lot of receiving work. But the problem is Nick Chubb isn't really seeing that much receiving work anyway. So I don't think that's going to be that big of a hindrance. I might honestly, sort of lean Aaron Jones because there might be more touchdown upside there.
Right.
But at the same time, Aaron Jones is a big regression candidate in the touchdown column. We saw this past week that Aaron Jones still has a pretty low floor. So, honestly, I don't have that strong of opinion. I don't want to pretend like I have that strong of opinion. I think it's a pretty fair, straight up, kind of lower end RB2s or RB1s rather from here on out kind of move.
Right. I think that the way I would look at it is that Nick Chubb's going to get more carries. Aaron Jones will probably get more targets, and we've seen those targets be pretty creative, and he has been a better offense. So I would lean Aaron Jones, although it's worth noting Jones has not yet had his bye, and Nick Chubb has. That's something to consider as well when deciding this for yourself. Dylan Lighty wants to know, better buy low candidate, Odell Beckham or Keenan Allen? Keenan Allen actually has been getting pretty good work. Didn't get a ton of work on Sunday against the Packers, but overall, his workload has still been good. Do you prefer him over Odell Beckham as a buy candidate right now?
I think I would. To be honest, when I was working on my 15 transactions column this week, I was considering Keenan Allen as more of a hold, not necessarily a buy, but that at least tells you that he's not a sell.
Right.
I think the big thing with Keenan Allen right now is this target distribution and how it works with Hunter Henry. We don't have that significant of a sample size, but what we do know is that historically, when Hunter Henry, 2 years ago when Hunter Henry was healthy versus last year when he wasn't healthy, what we saw was a difference in running back targets as opposed to wide receiver targets. Mm-hmm. We saw Keenan Allen's target share and the wide receivers' target share kind of remain the same, whereas we saw a 5% dip and rise at running back, and then tight end it dipped last year without Hunter Henry there. So I think that Hunter Henry still kind of impacts Melvin Gordon and Austin Eckler indirectly a little bit more, as weird as that might sound.
Right.
But there is some correlation between tight end targets and running back targets in general. But those running backs are being targeted more than we expected since Melvin Gordon's been back. Now, with Odell Beckham, I just worry that the upside is not going to be there. We've seen Baker Mayfield over the last couple of weeks not throw the ball down the field at all. I think he's averaging like 6% of his passes over the last 2 weeks, going 15 plus air yards. It's just a really, really tough offense to buy into right now. Obviously, Odell Beckham has all the talent in the world, but I think that I would lean Keenan Allen at this point.
In the 4 games since Hunter Henry came back, Keenan Allen has 40% of the Chargers' deep targets. So I think it's a good spot to buy him, and I agree with your reservations on Odell Beckham. Jason Charles Lyon wants to know, we talked about Kenyon Drake before. What's the outlook for David Johnson the rest of the way? I would assume he probably gets into full practice this week. We're probably not going to get a good read on the situation from Cliff Kingsbury. So is David Johnson someone you can tolerate starting on the road against Tampa Bay with Kenyon Drake being there?
I mean, I'm going to assume that people won't have better options there. Maybe you lucked into or you bought into Devin Singletary or something, and then you have like a real dilemma on your hands. But I think David Johnson moving forward, I don't think we're going to see the top 6 running back numbers like we saw to start the season, not just because Kenyon Drake is there and they have a more crowded backfield, but there were times where he was overperforming a little bit. And even by the eye test, I think Kenyon Drake looked just as good as David Johnson's looked all year. Right. But like I said earlier, I think that what we could see is David Johnson being used a little bit more as a wide receiver because they do run those 4 wide sets pretty consistently in that offense. And so as a result, he's going to be a decent option in PPR formats. I look at DJ moving forward as a high-end RB2.
Yeah, and David Johnson and Chase Edmonds were both running snaps as wide receivers before all these injuries hit, and I would assume they would go back to that. And that can be good volume. It's not good volume when it's Tariq Cohen because the Bears offense doesn't really operate that well. But for David Johnson, it can be pretty valuable. So he's probably someone I'd be okay starting unless you have really good options. Dustin Allen Gibbs asks, what do y'all think about the Dolphins? Obviously, Preston Williams is now done for the year, which stinks because he was balling out. Now Mark Walton suspended for the next 4 games. So you've got guys like Kalen Ballage, potentially Devontae Parker. We've got Albert Smith. We got guys on the wire. Are you going to any of them? Albert Wilson on the wire. Are you going to any of the Dolphins here on the wire? And how would you rank those guys?
Yeah, it's a generic last name. It's easy to go. Yeah, I got you.
And it's also 2 first names, kind of. So
I got you. So Devontae Parker has been low key awesome in fantasy. Maybe awesome's too strong of a word, but look at what he's done since week 4. He's been wide receiver 14, 26, 15, 32, and 21. When you're getting that kind of consistency, he's not giving you wide receiver 1 numbers, but he's giving you lower end wide receiver 2 numbers pretty easily. Without Preston Williams there, he should see a pretty high target share. He's already seeing, with Ryan Fitzpatrick under center, he's seeing about 23.5% of the team's targets. So I think Devontae Parker should absolutely be added off the waiver wire. If you're really, 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 really struggling, you could look at Mike Gesicki, who came through with a decent performance this past week. He could be someone who benefits from that Preston Williams injury a little bit indirectly. But other than that, I'm not really that hyped. Even with the Mark Walton news and Kalen Ballage, if you look, of all the Dolphins running backs performances this year, no Dolphin has ranked higher than RB21 in a single week. So they're not giving you much upside to begin with. Only Cincinnati as a team has scored fewer running back points in fantasy football. So, and also I don't think Kalen Ballage is very good. So there's a lot of reason to not buy into that. I think Devontae Parker, though, is the guy that you would want in this offense.
Yeah, definitely. And I think if you look at the snap rates after Preston Williams left, Albert Wilson was a guy who prompted the most, but what are you going to get there? I mean, Preston Williams is being very effective in that volume. So I'd agree that it's not necessarily a situation where you have to buy into this offense. Shade Fordham wants to know, does Jalen Samuels have any value going forward, or should he be dropped? Sounds like James Conner is more likely to return this week than was initially thought. Sounds like Mike Tomlin's pretty optimistic he'll be able to get back out there. But Jalen Samuels would have a lot of value if James Conner could not go. So are you holding on to Jalen Samuels right now, given what we know?
Yeah, for two reasons. Number one, it's handcuff season. You need to be adding these higher upside guys who will take on a bigger role if an injury occurs. And Jalen Samuels, obviously, we just saw this past week, he has a pretty big role if James Conner's not healthy. But number two, I think that he can carve out a role and maybe be a flex play in a deeper league or a PPR format. We saw him be heavily involved against Cincinnati about a month ago or so when they were running a lot of Wildcat. But I think that the Steelers are, if you look at what's happened to James Conner this year, he's been basically questionable for over half of his games. So I think that if, logically, the Steelers are going to look at James Conner and say, we don't want to run him into the ground, and we have a very capable Swiss Army knife back in Jalen Samuels. Oh, and by the way, we don't have many proven pass catchers on this team. I think Jalen Samuels can still carve out a role as a pass catcher while James Conner just, takes the majority of the early down work.
Yeah, the last time that Jalen Samuels and James Conner played a full game together, Jalen Samuels had 8 targets. Then he had 4 in the following game before getting hurt. So he'll still be involved, it seems like, even when Conner is healthy, which makes him valuable. And then you kind of know he'll be a viable guy if something does happen to Conner once again. Jim Hales wants to know, is Goddard worth keeping over the bye? His end-of-season schedule is great, but Ertz is taking over. We did see Ertz have a good game on Sunday, but now with Deshaun Jackson going to likely injured reserve with the surgery that he had today, seems like they should stick with more 2 tight end sets, which was kind of the concern we had with Dallas Goedert entering last week. Now, that's probably not as big of a concern. So is Goddard someone you would keep through the bye, assuming you don't have someone like Austin Hooper or Gerald Everett coming back from a bye to replace him?
Yeah, so Goddard is only owned in 26% of Yahoo leagues when that number realistically should be over 50%. He's now seen double-digit target share in each of his last 6 games, which is not an easy thing to do, not just for a tight end in general, but for a waiver wire tight end, this guy who's out there in the majority of leagues. And then this past week, he played the most snaps that he's played. He had the highest snap share of his entire season, despite the fact that Zach Ertz went off. So Dallas Goedert up until that week, the 3 weeks prior to week 9, Dallas Goedert was outperforming Zach Ertz. He basically had double the amount of fantasy points that Zach Ertz had. Just because Ertz had this big performance doesn't mean we should give up on Dallas Goedert, because Goddard has essentially been a lower end tight end 1 over the last month. So right. I think he should absolutely be on your roster.
And Zach Ertz being successful is not something that's going to preclude Dallas Goedert from being successful. It's kind of like how 2 receivers in the same team can be successful. They're on the field at the same time, so they can both have good games. So Zach Ertz being better does not mean you should give up on Dallas Goedert. Daniel Chung is asking, is Brandon Cooks droppable at this point? We don't know the outlook for Brandon Cooks. Another scary concussion for him. Sean McVay has said they want to take things slow, but they've also said that he's asymptomatic. And I think that kind of clouds things here as far as projecting when Brandon Cooks will be back. So are you hanging on to Cooks right now, given that we don't know a whole lot of when he could be back?
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine there's someone on your waiver wire that's going to be that much better than Brandon Cooks. You could maybe look at Zach Pascal or something if you need a fill in this week, or even Josh Reynolds is a decent waiver wire ad this week because Brandon Cooks might not play. But from a long-term perspective, both of those guys aren't going to have as big of, obviously Josh Reynolds won't have that big of a role if Brandon Cooks is back. Right. And then Pascal won't have as big of a role if T.Y. Hilton's back. So I think Brandon Cooks is still someone that you want to hold on to.
And I would agree with that. And he had some frustrating weeks before that concussion, but he's still Brandon Cooks. He's still an integral part of that offense. And that offense had faced a lot of really tough matchups, too. So I think Brandon Cooks, once he gets back out there, should be a pretty usable piece. Blake Tiffany Lowe asks, trade high on Chark with Nick Foles coming back. We kind of talked about this before, where we still like DJ Chark the rest of the way. Would you try to sell him, or is he more of a hold to you?
No, I think he's actually a buy. And I had that in my 15 transactions column this week. I know that he's overperformed a little bit in the touchdown column this year, but he's still seen over 23% of Jacksonville's targets. He's hit a 20% target share in 5 of his last 6 games. And in the fantasy playoffs, they still get Atlanta and Oakland. They also face Tampa Bay down the stretch. But in the fantasy playoffs, getting Atlanta and Oakland, who are 2 teams that rank in the bottom 4 in fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers, DJ Chark is more of a buy than a sell right now.
That is awesome. I did not know that, and I'm very happy about that. Brad Sanger wants to know thoughts on Damian Williams going forward. Had a big role on Sunday. Didn't have a ton of volume, but played about 75% of the snaps, and now may get Patrick Mahomes back. They may have the left side of their offensive line back here pretty soon as well. So what are your thoughts on Damian Williams given a pretty encouraging day on Sunday, even outside of just that long touchdown?
I feel like this is one of those questions that when I ask my daughter, she just kind of puts her hands up and says, I don't know. I just, it's a very basic question that I asked my daughter. This is a little bit more convoluted because we don't know what the heck Andy Reid is thinking when he throws his running backs in the backfield. Damian Williams, though, this past week saw 3/4 of the team's running back rushes. He played his highest snap rate of the season. It looks from an evidence perspective that Damian Williams is the running back that you want in this backfield right now. That down the stretch, he might sort of, maybe not fully, but sort of live up to where you drafted him earlier this season. But we've seen this before with LaShawn McCoy seeing a lot of work, and then the next week having fumbling issues and maybe not seeing the field as much. That's really the fear. But I would still be holding on to Damian Williams regardless, because we saw that he had legit top 5 upside down the stretch last year. Patrick Mahomes is coming back. We know that they can get their running backs involved as receivers, and we know the touchdown upside is going to be there because with Patrick Mahomes back, they're going to score more. So I think Damian Williams is a hold. I wouldn't be going out to buy him. I wouldn't be dropping him. And if there's one running back in this backfield that I would want rest of season, I'd say this without any confidence at all, but it would probably be Damian Williams.
Yeah, like he's a guy you could use this week, but it's hard to say what his rest of season value is because things change very quickly in that offense for sure. One final question here. Do we drop Robbie Anderson? Obviously, gets to work down the field, has a good schedule, but didn't do well even against Miami. So are you holding on to Robbie right now?
I think you're holding on. It was one of the most disappointing performances, I think, this past week because everything was in Robbie Anderson's favor from a matchup perspective. But I think you're holding on because of what we saw before that Patriots game. And we know, with Robbie Anderson, with Sam Darnold extending to the end of last season, had been really, really effective. So I think things can change. We just need that offensive line to protect Sam Darnold, give him a little bit more time, get a little bit more push. And that should at least enable Robbie Anderson to get down the field. But I wouldn't be dropping him. I think he's more of a hold, probably not a starter, though.
Yeah, and Robbie has a lot of deep targets. He has 21% of the overall targets since Darnold returned, so he's still usable. He's just volatile, which is kind of what Robbie Anderson has always been. That is all we have for today. Do you want to thank you all for tuning into this FanDuel Facebook Live, the Q&A. JJ will be back with you on Sunday to get you set with those start-sit questions at noon right here, same place at noon. JJ, what else is going on for you for the rest of this week?
Yeah, got the Late Round Podcast, 4 episodes dropping this week, as always. Today, the 15 Transactions Show dropped. Tomorrow will be the 10 Trends Show, and then the Matchup Show on Thursday, which hopefully is better than last week's Matchup Show, which was probably the worst one that I've ever put together. And then Friday, the Mailbag Show, which is a lot of fun as well. So the Late Round Podcast, you can get it anywhere podcasts can be found.
And you can also find the Number Fire Daily Fantasy Podcast feed by searching wherever you can find podcasts. We'll have our Week 10 DFS preview going up on Thursday morning with myself and Brandon Gadula. You can check that out. And from a betting perspective, we have Covering the Spread with myself and Dr. Ed Feng going up every Wednesday and Thursday for college and pro football. Big thank you to Calvin Theobald for running the video side of things for today. Thank you, Cal, as always, for keeping us on the air here. And thank you to everyone for tuning in for this FanDuel Waiver Wire Q&A. JJ is back with you on Sunday. Good luck with those waivers and good luck with Week 10. We'll talk to you again next week.